Konnichiwa. Today we're going to talk about one of the most versatile aspects of Japanese structure. It covers a number of areas that can be compared to other aspects of Japanese structure, and it'll make life a lot simpler if we make those comparisons. So that's what we're going to do. This is something that isn't really explained well by most textbooks, largely because they don't recognize the verb stem system, which is absolutely central to the way Japanese verbs work. So, what it is, what we're going to talk about, is the I stem of Japanese verbs. In Japanese, it is called the then-yo-ke, which means the connective use form. And they might call it the great connector, because it does a whole range of different connecting jobs, which we're going to talk about now. In English, it's sometimes called the masu stem, which is not inaccurate because, of course, it does, among many other things, connect the helper verb masu. I don't like this expression because it stems from the whole ecology where the so-called masu form of verbs, which means verbs shifted into the I stem and having the masu helper verb attached to them, were at the base form of verbs. It's not the base form of verbs. It's just verbs with one among many other helper elements attached to them. And if we think it's the base form of verbs, we're going to get very confused about what verbs are and how they work. And I've done a video about that, so if you're in any doubt about all of this, you might want to watch that. So what is this I stem, this ren-yo-ke, and why is that so important? Well, obviously what it is simply the shifted from its base form to the ku, ending verbs end in ki, si, and new verbs have them sit, and so forth. Because this is such a wide-ranging structural element, I'm going to compare it to a couple of different things. The first thing, the most obvious thing to compare it to, is the other three verb stems. It's similar to them, of course, because, like all of them, it is used for attaching fundamental helpers. And by fundamental helpers, I mean the things that sometimes get called conjugations in the textbooks. As we know, there is no such thing as conjugation in Japanese. There are just four stems and various helper verbs, nouns, and adjectives, some of which get arbitrarily called conjugations, some of which don't, and depending on which textbook you read, you'll probably get a slightly different take on which ones are conjugations and which aren't, which is perfectly natural because it's a wholly arbitrary category anyway. There's no such thing as conjugation in Japanese, so the whole thing is fantasy. Then we don't necessarily expect consistency in fantasy. So, the I stem, as we know, connects imasu, helper verb. It also connects a variety of what we may call dedicated helper nouns and helper adjectives. Generally, if we're going to attach helper adjective or helper noun to a verb, we're going to attach it to the I stem. This isn't absolute, but it happens nearly all the time. As we know, the helper adjective nai attaches to the a stem, but that's unusual. So, we can attach a variety of helper adjectives to the I stem. For example, I'm going to take the verb yomu as our model for most of what we're doing today. So let's take the verb yomu and turn it to the I stem yomi, and we can attach adjectives like yasui, yomi yasui, easy to read, literal, yomi nukui, hard to read. We also attach things like nagara. Nagara means doing one thing while doing another, so you can say aruki nagara yomu, or yomi nagara ongaku ochiku. So that's while walking, I read. While reading, I listen to music. The so helper, which gives us the meaning of likeness, that also is attached to verbs with the istem. So we say, Amiga huri so, da, it looks like rain. And I've talked about this so and various related structures in another video, which I'll link. Now, this shifts into the area where we can start to compare the istem, the lenyote, the great connector, to the diphthong. Now, the diphthong is the other great connector. Of course, it connects all kinds of things. The istem is an even greater connector. It can connect most of the kinds of things that the diphthong also connects, and it can do a lot else beside. So with the diphthong, we often connect helper verbs that are not dedicated helpers, that have a life of their own outside their helper capacity. So we say mo kekuru, which means fetch, hold, and come. We can say yattemiru, give it a try, literally do and see. Now, in the same way, we can produce compound verbs with the istem. For example, we say furimawasu, wave around. And to return to our friend Yomi, we can say yomi hajimeru, which means start reading, or yomi komu, which means read and pack in, which actually means load in a computer sense. And I've done a whole video on this komu, which you can watch if you're interested in. I'll put a link above and in the information section below, along with everything else. On a computer loading screen, you'll often see yomikami chair, which is interesting because here you see we have two istems stacked together. Yomikomu itself takes the istem and connects to chu, middle. So yomikami chu is literally read, pack in, middle, in the process of loading. And this of course is a noun. Chu is a noun, and any compound takes on the character of its last element in Japanese. So yomikami chu goes for noun formed by a compound of two istem verbs and a noun. And this leads on to something that the istem can do that the diphthong can't, and that is join verbs to nouns to make new nouns. So for example, we have nakimushi. Naki is the istem of naku, cry. Mushi means insect, so nakimushi is a cryback, which is the Japanese term for a crybaby. And to come again to our friend yomi, we can have yomi kata. Kata means form or manner or way. You may have heard of kata in karate, the martial art. So yomi kata means form or way or manner of reading. And what this usually means is the pronunciation of a kanji, the way of reading the kanji in a particular context. So the istem has a compound word capacity of the diphthong and takes it further than a diphthong. And it can also take on another of the diphthong's fundamental functions. Because as we know, the diphthong can connect the two halves of a compound sentence. You could say, omise ni itte pan wakatta. So we have two logical clauses there. I went to the shops and I bought some bread. And instead of using and, the way we do in English, we use the diphthong. I've done a video about compound sentences, which I'll link. Now the istem can do exactly the same thing. We can say, omise ni itte pan wakatta, which is exactly the same as saying omise ni itte pan wakatta. We don't hear it quite so often, but it's not uncommon at all. You'll see it more in written form, but if you're doing any immersion at all, if you read books, if you have text-heavy games, and in manga and anime, you will come across this istem joining of compound sentences. It's another fundamental piece of Japanese. So you see, the istem can do most of what the diphthong can do. with compound words, it doesn't compound the same words as the te form, but it compounds words in very much the same manner. But the e stem doesn't stop there. It can do one other thing, which is very important. It gives us a noun form of verbs. You've talked before about what's sometimes called nominalizing verbs, that's to say using the no or koto of the mother means job, bundle, something verbal into a noun. Now, this isn't really nominalizing verbs, which is why I tend to avoid that terminology, because what we're actually doing here is not turning a verb to a noun, but turning an entire mere jaws into some kind of a noun. We're not actually turning it into a noun. What we're doing is bundling it into a box created by a pronoun like a no or koto. And I've talked in various places about putting verb clauses into a no box or into a koto box. In some cases, of course, we may also be bundling into that pronoun literally a single verb. So if we say oyogu no tafukida, we're saying I like swimming. And that means I like the activity of swimming. But again, this isn't what the e stem does. What the e stem does is give us the true noun form of a verb. And in English, it's usually represented by the unchanged verb, so that the verb form and the noun form are identical in English. In Japanese, they're not identical. In Japanese, we have the base form, the ending form of the verb for there, and for the noun form, we have the e stem. So let's take an example so you know what I'm talking about here. In English, we have rest, word rest, which can be a verb or a noun. We use the verb rest when we say, I need to rest. We use the noun rest when we say, I need a rest. So if we take the verb yasumu in Japanese as a kind of rough equivalent to rest in English, we have yasumu, which is the verb rest, and yasumi, which is the noun rest. So yasumu is the action of resting, the verb rest. Yasumi is a rest, the noun rest. And we use this both on its own and in compounds like natsu yasumi, which means summer vacation or summer break. We see we wouldn't call it the summer rest in English, but that's because, as we've discussed before, it's very rare for a Japanese word to cover exactly the same area of the meaning spectrum as an English word. So the word yasumi can mean rest, literally as in lying down, taking a rest. It can mean being off school or off work because you're sick. It can mean a vacation, like natsu yasumi. But the point is that the verb form is yasumu, the noun form is yasumi. And just about any verb that can have, logically, a noun form will have that noun form represented by the e stem of the verb. And very often these will be the same thing in English. Sometimes they will be different. So, for example, itemu means hurt. Itami means claim. Again, we have a noun form of hurt, which is pain. And this is very important because not only does it give us this whole range of verb-formed nouns, but also it plays a role in other structures which are very rarely explained by the textbooks. So if we say, for example, omise ni han okae ni ika boy, koen ni asobi ni ika. What do we mean by the e stem of kao, which is kai, or the e stem of hasobu, which is asobi? What we mean is the noun. So when we say koen ni hasobi ni iku, they're marking the notational target of the place we're going. We're going to the park, koen. And then we're stating our purpose. Our purpose is this thing of playing, this thing of having fun. and that is asobi. So literally we're saying, I'm going to the park for play. If we say, we're saying, I'm going to the shop for bread buying. This is how these are structured, and very few textbooks actually ever explain that what we're using here is the noun from the verb. And that's important, because as I've taught in our lesson on the logical particles, the 5 main logical particles can only be attached to vowels. So if it's not explained that the asobi here and the kai here are nouns, I'm not sure what Mathlana's fit the structure actually needs. And we're finding various structures that the noun form of a verb is used, and the structure only really makes sense if we understand that it is the noun form of the verb. So here we have the e-stem. It's the great connector, and it's also the fundamental noun of a verb forming stem. So it has a very wide range of applications. It does all the kinds of things a regular stem can do. It does all the kinds of things that te form can do. Then it creates nouns after verbs to be used as regular nouns like itami, pain, why, yasumi, a rest, some rest, and also for deeper structures like asobi ni, into going for play, going for the activity of play. If you have any questions or comments, please put them in the comments below, and I will answer as usual. I'd like to thank my Gold Kokeshi patrons, and all of my patrons and supporters on Patreon and everywhere who make all of this possible, and I'd like to thank you for attending this lesson. これからもよろしくお願いします。Class dismissed.